The dust devils danced a jig across the parched earth as Jess squinted, the midday sun hammering down on the makeshift auction block. It was hotter than a branding iron in July, but the heat wasn't what made her stomach churn. It was the woman. Not a woman, really. A girl, barely past 16, dressed in the stark black habit of a sister of mercy. Her face was pale, smudged with dirt, and her eyes, wide and haunted, darted around the crowd like a trapped bird. Jess knew the story, whispered on the wind like bad luck, the convent in Indian Territory. Raided by Comanches, the other sisters, gone. This one, spared for reasons Jess couldn't fathom, now stood before a gaggle of leering men, each bidding for her like she was a prize mare. Jess tightened her grip on the worn leather reins of her mule, Blue. She'd come to town for supplies, nothing more. But the sight of that girl, that innocent face framed by the unforgiving sun, clawed at something deep inside her. A fat man with a walrus mustache spat tobacco juice onto the dusty ground. $5! He bellowed, his voice thick with liquor. 7. A skinny, weasel-faced man countered, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. The auctioneer, a slick-haired fellow in a too-tight suit, grinned. $7, gentlemen. A bargain, I say. A real bargain. Jess's hand instinctively moved to the Winchester rifle, strapped to her saddle. She hadn't used it in anger for years. Not since, well, some things were best left buried. But the urge to level it at the crowd, to silence their ugly voices, was almost overwhelming. Then a figure moved in the periphery. A tall, lean man, his face hidden beneath the brim of a well-worn Stetson. He stood silent, almost invisible against the backdrop of the saloon. Jess knew him by sight, even though he rarely spoke. Folks called him Stone, though nobody knew his real name. He ranched up north, a solitary figure, known more for his quiet competence than his conversation. Ed watched the whole scene unfold, his expression unreadable. The bidding climbed, reaching $10. The nun's breath hitched. Jess saw a single tear track down her cheek, leaving a clean streak in the grime. Stone shifted. A subtle movement, barely perceptible. But Jess saw it. He raised a hand, not to bid, but to wait. And in that moment, Jess knew, somehow, that things were about to change. The auctioneer, wiping sweat from his brow, looked ready to declare the weasel-faced man the victor. Going once, going twice. Jess's knuckles turned white against the reins. $10. A pittance for a human soul. She glanced back at Stone. He hadn't moved, his silhouette a dark, unwavering presence against the sun-baked wall of the saloon. His silence was a force of its own, a coiled spring of something she couldn't quite decipher. She knew a little about Stone, as much as anyone did. Whispers, rumors, all. Had come to the territory a few years back, bought a hard-scrabbled patch of land nobody else wanted, and built a life out of grit and silence. Some said he was running from something. Some said he was just a loner. But Jess had seen something else in his eyes. A flicker of, what? Regret? Loss. She remembered hearing, years ago, that he'd been training for the ministry before the war. A promising young man, they said, full of fire and faith. Then the war came, and something broke inside him. The auctioneer's voice boomed, sold to Mr. Grimes for $10. Jess felt a surge of anger, hot and sudden. Not just at the men, but at herself. for standing by, for hesitating. She remembered her own hardships, the losses she had endured, the times when a single act of kindness could have made all the difference. The nun flinched as Grimes reached for her, his greasy hand closing around her arm. Jess couldn't stand it anymore. She spurred Blue forward, the mule grunting in protest. Crowd parted, startled by the sudden movement. Jess reined in beside the auction block, her gaze fixed on the nun. "Hold up," she said, her voice rough from disuse. Every head turned. The auctioneer sputtered, "Ma'am, the bidding is closed. The girl's been sold." Jess ignored him. Her eyes met the nun's. She saw fear, but also a flicker of something else. A desperate hope. "I'll pay 15, Jess stated, her voice cutting through the air. A murmur rippled through the crowd. $15 was a significant sum. Grimes' face twisted with rage. "You can't just barge in like that," he snarled. "I won her fair and square." Jess dismounted, her movement slow and deliberate. She walked towards the auction block, her spurs clicking on the hard-packed dirt. She stopped directly in front of Grimes, her gaze unwavering. "Fair and square?" she repeated, her voice low and dangerous. "There ain't nothing fair about this." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a wad of bills. She peeled off $15 and tossed it at the auctioneer's feet. "Shares with me now." The bills fluttered in the dust at the auctioneer's feet, a stark declaration against the leering faces. Grimes sputtered, a vein throbbing in his forehead. "You can't just buy her out. It ain't right. I won that auction." Jess's gaze didn't waver. It was fixed on Grimes, a cold, hard stare that spoke volumes. Years of weathering hardship had etched a quiet strength into her face, a resilience that intimidated even the most hardened men. "Right is what you make it, mister Grimes. And this ain't right." She turned her attention to the nun, her voice softening slightly. "Come on, sister. Let's get you out of this sun." She offered her hand, calloused and strong. The nun hesitated, her eyes darting between Jess and Grimes. Fear warred with a desperate hope. Grimes' grip tightened on her arm, his knuckles white. He wasn't about to give up his prize so easily. "She's mine," he growled, yanking the girl closer. "I paid for her." Jess's hand moved with surprising speed. Before anyone could react, Shed gripped Grimes' wrist, her fingers digging into his flesh. His face contorted in pain. "Go," Jess said, each word a separate, distinct threat. The air crackled with tension. The crowd held its breath, sensing the volatile undercurrent beneath Jess's quiet demeanor. Grimes, realizing he was outmatched, reluctantly released his grip. The nun stumbled back, her eyes wide with shock. Jess gently guided her away from the auction block, towards Blue. "Get on the mule, sister," she instructed, her voice firm but kind. The nun obeyed, her movements stiff and uncertain. Jess helped her settle onto the saddle, then turned back to face the crowd. "The show's over, folks," she announced, her voice carrying across the dusty square. "Go on home. Find something better to do with your time." A few grumbled, but no one dared challenge her directly. They knew Jess was a woman to be reckoned with. They'd seen the glint in her eye, the steel in her spine. And they'd heard the rumors about her past, the whispers about what she'd done, the life she'd left behind. Best not to cross her. Jess mounted Blue behind the nun, taking up the reins. As she turned the mule towards the edge of town, she caught Stone's eye. He still stood silently against the saloon wall, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his Stetson. But Jess thought she saw a flicker of something akin to approval in his gaze. Or maybe it was just the sun playing tricks on her eyes. Either way, she didn't need his approval. She'd done what she had to do, and that was enough. The setting sun bled across the sky, painting the desert in hues of orange and purple as Jess urged Blue onward. Sarah, still trembling, clung to Jess's back, the black habit a stark contrast against the vibrant landscape. The town was a distant memory, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Jess knew Grimes wouldn't let it go. He was the kind of man who held a grudge tighter than a tick on a hound. He'd be back, with friends. She had to put as much distance between them and him as possible. They rode in silence, the only sound the rhythmic clop of Blue's hooves and the whisper of the wind through the scrub brush. Jess kept a watchful eye on the horizon, scanning for any sign of pursuit. She knew the desert was a harsh mistress, unforgiving to the unprepared. But it was also a sanctuary, a place where a person could disappear if they knew how to navigate its secrets. As darkness deepened, Jess guided Blue towards a narrow canyon, the walls rising high on either side, offering a semblance of shelter. She dismounted, helping Sarah down. The girl's legs were stiff, her face pale in the moonlight. "Well, rest here for a while," Jess said, her voice low. "Get some sleep. We'll ride again before dawn." Sarah nodded, her eyes wide and frightened. She didn't speak, but Jess could feel her gratitude, a silent weight in the air. Jess found a small alcove in the canyon wall and spread out her bedroll. She offered Sarah a share of her meager rations, dried beef and hardtack. The girl ate sparingly, her appetite dulled by fear. After they'd eaten, Jess pulled out her canteen and offered it to Sarah. The girl drank deeply, then handed it back, her eyes meeting Jess's for the first time without fear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jess nodded. "Don't mention it." Silence settled between them again, broken only by the rustling of unseen creatures in the darkness. Jess sat with her back against the canyon wall, her rifle across her lap, her senses on high alert. She knew they weren't safe yet. Grimes could track them, or worse, hire someone who could. She had to stay vigilant, protect the girl. She glanced at Sarah, huddled in the bedroll, her eyes closed. The girl looked so young, so vulnerable. Jess wondered what she had seen, what horrors she'd endured at the hands of the Comanches. She wondered if she'd ever be able to heal, to find peace again. Jess thought of her own past, the scars she carried, the memories that haunted her dreams. She knew what it was like to lose everything, to be stripped bare and left to face the world alone. That's why she couldn't stand by and watch Sarah be sold like a piece of property. She couldn't let another soul be broken. The desert wind howled, a mournful cry that echoed through the canyon. Jess closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the night. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready. She'd faced worse, and she wouldn't let anything happen to this girl. She'd made a promise, a silent vow, to protect her, and she intended to keep it, no matter the cost. The cold seeped into Jess's bones, a familiar ache she'd learned to ignore. The desert offered beauty, yes, in its stark landscapes and fiery sunsets, but it demanded a price. Tonight, the price was a bone-chilling wind that cut through even the thickest wool. Sarah stirred in her sleep, mumbling something unintelligible. Jess watched her, the rifle heavy in her hands. She wondered about the girl's past, the life shed led before the Comanches, before the auction block. What kind of nun was she? Had she chosen that life, or had it been chosen for her? Jess had never been one for organized religion, but she respected a person who stood for something, who believed in something bigger than themselves. The sun began to paint the eastern sky with streaks of pink and orange. Jess nudged Sarah awake. "Time to ride," she said, her voice gruff. Sarah sat up, her eyes still clouded with sleep. She looked around the canyon, her expression a mixture of fear and confusion. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Away from here," Jess replied, her tone brooking no argument. She helped Sarah pack her meager belongings, then saddled Blue. As they prepared to leave, Sarah turned to Jess, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said again, her voice stronger this time. "For saving me." Jess shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Don't get any ideas. I didn't do it for you." The words were harsh, but Jess didn't want Sarah getting too comfortable, too dependent. She'd learned long ago that relying on others was a recipe for disappointment. Better to keep your distance, to protect yourself from the inevitable hurt. I couldn't stand to see you treated like that," Jess continued, her voice softening slightly. "Nobody deserves that." She didn't elaborate, didn't explain the darkness that lived inside her, the memories that fueled her actions. She just wanted Sarah to understand that her motives weren't entirely altruistic. There was a selfish element to it, a need to right a wrong, to atone for past sins. Sarah nodded, her eyes understanding. She didn't push for more information, didn't pry into Jess's past. She seemed to sense that some things were best left unsaid. Jess helped Sarah onto Blue, then mounted behind her. She kicked the mule into motion, urging him out of the canyon and back into the open desert. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the land and casting long shadows across the sand. They rode in silence, two women bound together by circumstance, their fates intertwined in the vast, unforgiving landscape. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. But for the first time in a long time, Jess felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference. And maybe, in the process, she could find a little redemption for herself. The sun beat down mercilessly as they rode, the heat shimmering off the sand in disorienting waves. Jess kept a close watch on Sarah. The girl was pale and drawn, her movements listless. The ride was taking its toll. The Comanches hadn't been kind, and the auction hadn't helped. Jess cursed, inwardly. She needed to find shelter, water, and soon. As the day wore on, Jess spotted a cluster of scrubby trees in the distance, a faint promise of shade. She urged Blue toward it, hoping it wasn't just a mirage. As they drew closer, she saw it was real, a small oasis of sorts. A few stunted trees clinging to life around a dried-up creek bed. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Jess dismounted, helping Sarah down. The girl stumbled, her legs weak. Jess caught her arm, steadying her. "Easy now," she said, her voice gruff but concerned. "Well, rest here." She led Sarah to the shade of one of the trees and helped her sit down. Sarah leaned against the trunk, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. Jess examined her face. The girl was feverish, her skin clammy. Jess knew she had to do something, and fast. She rummaged through her saddlebags, pulling out a small tin of ointment and a strip of clean cloth. She knelt beside Sarah, gently lifting the sleeve of her habit. Beneath the fabric, Jess saw the extent of the girl's injuries. Crude bandages, stained with blood and pus, covered deep cuts and welts. The Comanches hadn't been gentle. Sarah flinched as Jess began to clean the wounds, her eyes fluttering open. "It's all right," Jess murmured, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Just cleaning them up." She worked quickly and efficiently, her hands surprisingly deft despite their calloused roughness. She cleaned the wounds with water from her canteen, then applied the ointment. Sarah winced in pain, but she didn't cry out. She just bit her lip and stared straight ahead. As Jess bandaged the wounds, she noticed a brand on Sarah's shoulder, a crude symbol burned into her skin. It was the mark of the Comanches, a sign of ownership. Jess felt a surge of anger, a primal rage that threatened to consume her. How could anyone treat another human being like this? She finished bandaging the wounds, then sat back on her heels, studying Sarah's face. The girl was exhausted, her spirit broken. Jess knew that physical wounds could heal, but the emotional scars might last a lifetime. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small piece of dried beef. "Here," she said, offering it to Sarah. "Eat something." Sarah shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm not hungry." "You need to eat," Jess insisted, her voice firm. "You need to keep your strength up." Sarah reluctantly took the beef and nibbled at it, her appetite clearly gone. Jess watched her, her heart aching for the girl. She knew she couldn't erase her past, couldn't take away the pain, but she could offer her a chance at a new life, a chance to heal and find peace. And that's what she intended to do. As the sun began to set, Jess built a small fire, using dried twigs and scrub brush. The flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The air grew cooler, and Jess wrapped Sarah in a blanket. They sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the wind. Jess knew they were still in danger. Grimes could be out there, searching for them. But for now, they had a moment of respite. A brief pause in the relentless struggle for survival. The quiet didn't last. The desert held its breath, then exhaled a warning. A faint flicker on the horizon, a dust devil dancing where no wind should be. Jess's hand tightened on the rifle. It wasn't Grimes. Grimes wouldn't be subtle. This was something else. Something more professional. Bounty hunters. Word of Jess's interference in the auction, coupled with her own checkered past, would have reached far and wide. There was likely a price on her head, a tempting sum for men who lived by the gun and the greed in their hearts. She nudged Sarah gently. "Get behind me. Stay quiet." Sarah's eyes widened, fear replacing the exhaustion. She understood. She had seen enough violence to recognize the signs. She scrambled behind Jess, clutching the rough fabric of her shirt. Jess rose slowly, her movements deliberate, her senses on high alert. She scanned the approaching figures. Two riders, lean and weathered, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats. They rode with a confidence that spoke of experience, of countless hunts and captures. "Hold it right there," one of them shouted, his voice harsh and gravelly. He reined in his horse, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Jess Harper, I presume." Jess didn't answer. She knew any words would be wasted. These men weren't interested in explanations, only in the reward. We know you're harboring a runaway nun, the other bounty hunter added, his voice colder, more calculating. Hand her over, and maybe we'll let you walk away. Maybe. Jess spat on the ground. You'll have to come and get her. The bounty hunters exchanged a look. A grim smile spread across the face of the first one. That's what I was hoping you'd say. He drew his revolver, the click of the hammer echoing in the still desert air. The dance had begun. The bounty hunter's revolver barked, the shot kicking up sand near Jess's feet. She didn't flinch, didn't waste a movement. Years of living on the edge had honed her instincts, sharpened her reflexes. She dropped to a crouch, drawing her own rifle and firing in a single fluid motion. The first shot caught the bounty hunter by surprise. The bullet slammed into his chest, knocking him from his saddle. He hit the ground hard, the air whooshing from his lungs. His partner reacted instantly, firing back, but Jess was already moving, using the sparse trees as cover. The gunfight was brief, brutal. The bounty hunters were skilled, but Jess knew the terrain, knew how to use every rock and shadow to her advantage. She moved like a ghost, appearing and disappearing, firing with deadly accuracy. Sarah watched in horror, her hands clamped over her ears. The violence was terrifying, but she forced herself to stay calm, to trust in Jess's ability to protect them. She had seen a glimpse of the woman's strength, her unwavering resolve. It was enough to give her hope. As the second bounty hunter reloaded, Jess saw her chance. She emerged from behind a tree, firing a shot that grazed his arm. He cried out in pain, dropping his revolver. Before he could react, Jess was on him, disarming him and knocking him to the ground. She pressed the barrel of her rifle against his temple. "That's enough," she said, her voice cold and hard. "Get out of here, and don't come back." The bounty hunter stared up at her, his eyes filled with fear. He nodded weakly, then scrambled to his feet and ran towards his horse. He mounted quickly and rode off into the desert, leaving his fallen partner behind. Jess watched him go, her rifle still raised. She wouldn't trust them to stay gone, but she'd bought them some time. Time to move, to find a safer place. She turned to Sarah, her expression softening slightly. "Are you all right?" Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. "Yes," she whispered. "But what about him?" She gestured towards the fallen bounty hunter, who lay motionless on the ground. Jess glanced at the body. He made his choices. Now he has to live with them. Or not, she thought grimly. She helped Sarah to her feet. "We need to go." She gathered their belongings, saddled Blue, and helped Sarah mount. They rode away from the oasis, leaving the dead man behind, a grim reminder of the dangers that lurked in the west. As they rode, Sarah surprised Jess by taking the reins. "I can ride," she said, her voice stronger now. "Let me help." Jess hesitated, then nodded. She was surprised by Sarah's sudden assertiveness, her willingness to take control. Perhaps the girl wasn't as fragile as she seemed. Perhaps she possessed a hidden strength, a resilience that had been buried beneath layers of fear and trauma. Jess climbed off Blue, handing the reins to Sarah. She watched as the girl guided the mule forward, her shoulders straight, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The transformation was subtle, but it was there. Sarah was no longer just a victim, a damsel in distress. She was a survivor, a woman determined to reclaim her life. And Jess, for the first time in a long time, felt a glimmer of hope for the future. Maybe, just maybe, They could both find a way to escape the darkness that had haunted them for so long. The relentless sun climbed higher, baking the earth and turning the air thick and heavy. They rode for hours, pushing blue until the mule's breath came in ragged gasps. Jess scanned the horizon constantly, her senses on high alert. She knew the bounty hunter wouldn't give up easily. He'd be back with reinforcements. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jess spotted a narrow canyon in the distance. A trickle of water snaked through its base, carving a path through the red rock. "Widow Creek," she muttered, recognizing the landmark. It was a desolate place, but it offered cover, a place to make a stand. She led Sarah into the canyon, the walls rising steeply on either side. The air grew cooler, the silence broken only by the gentle murmur of the creek. Jess dismounted, helping Sarah down. "Well, rest here for a while," she said, her voice low. "But be ready to move at a moment's notice." She found a small cave hidden behind a cluster of boulders, a natural alcove that offered some protection. She helped Sarah inside, then set about building a small fire, using dried brush and twigs. The flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows on the canyon walls. They ate a meager meal of dried beef and hardtack, their conversation sparse. Sarah seemed calmer now, more focused. The ride had hardened her, stripped away some of the fear. She was learning to survive, to adapt to the harsh realities of the West. Suddenly, a twig snapped outside the cave. Jess froze, her hand instinctively reaching for her rifle. She peered into the darkness, her eyes straining to see. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice sharp and commanding. A figure emerged from the shadows, silhouetted against the fading light. It was the bounty hunter, the one she had spared. He was alone. "Harper," he said, his voice tight with anger. "I told you I'd be back." Jess stepped out of the cave, her rifle raised. "I told you to leave," she replied, her voice cold. "I can't do that," the bounty hunter said. "I got a job to do." "Then you're a fool," Jess said. "This canyon is a death trap. You don't stand a chance." "Maybe," the bounty hunter said, "but I'm not leaving without that nun." He drew his revolver, the metal glinting in the firelight. "This ends here, Harper." Jess leveled her rifle, her finger tightening on the trigger. The air crackled with tension. The standoff had begun. The bounty hunter's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking from Jess to the dark opening of the cave behind her. He knew Sarah was in there, vulnerable. He held all the cards. "Almost. Me. Let her go, Harper," he repeated, a sliver of desperation creeping into his voice. "This ain't your fight. You can walk away. He'll even give you a day's head start." Jess didn't lower her rifle. She knew he was lying. Had hunted her down too, once he had Sarah. Her reputation preceded her. She'd crossed too many powerful men. "It is my fight," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside her. Sarah wasn't just some runaway nun anymore. She was a responsibility, a burden she'd willingly taken on. And Jess Harper didn't abandon her burdens. The bounty hunter chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You're a fool, Harper. A stubborn, reckless fool. You think you can protect her? From me? From the world?" He took a step forward, his revolver unwavering. Jess mirrored his movement, her own weapon trained on his chest. The air hung thick with unspoken threats, the silence broken only by the crackling fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Jess knew this dance. She'd danced it countless times before. But this time, it felt different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Sarah, for a chance at a life free from the shadows of the past. She considered her options, weighing the odds. She could try to take him down, but he was quick, experienced. And even if she succeeded, there were bound to be others coming. News traveled fast in the West, especially when money was involved. She could run, try to lose him in the vast expanse of the desert. But Sarah was weak, still recovering. They wouldn't last long without water. There was another option, one she'd hoped to avoid. A sacrifice. She took a deep breath, the cool canyon air filling her lungs. "All right," she said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. The bounty hunter's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He hadn't expected her to back down. "All right," he repeated, suspicion lacing his tone. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you can have her," Jess said, her voice barely audible. "But you leave me alone. You promise me that, and I'll let her walk out of that cave." Sarah gasped from within the cave, a small, choked sound that tore at Jess's heart. She knew Sarah could hear them. She knew what Jess was offering. The bounty hunter hesitated, his gaze darting between Jess and the cave. He was weighing his options, calculating the risk. He could take them both, but that would be messy, dangerous. This way was clean, simple. "You swear?" he asked, his voice hardening. "You swear you won't come after us?" Jess met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I swear," she said. "On my life." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. She was condemning Sarah to a life she didn't deserve, a life of fear and uncertainty. But it was the only way. It was the only chance she had. "Sarah," Jess called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Come out. He's going to take you now." A long silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Jess didn't move, didn't flinch. She kept her rifle trained on the bounty hunter, her face a mask of stoic indifference. But inside, a storm raged. She'd broken her own code, sacrificed an innocent to save herself. The guilt gnawed at her, a familiar ache in the pit of her stomach. Finally, Sarah emerged from the cave, her face pale and drawn. She looked at Jess with a mixture of fear and betrayal in her eyes. Jess couldn't meet her gaze. She stared at the ground, ashamed. "Don't do this," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, Jess. Don't leave me." The bounty hunter stepped forward, grabbing Sarah's arm. She flinched, but didn't resist. She knew it was over. "Let's go," he said, his voice cold and triumphant. He dragged Sarah away, towards his horse. Jess watched them go, her hands clenched into fists. She wanted to scream, to fight, to tear him apart. But she'd made a promise. And Jess Harper always kept her promises, even when they broke her heart. As they disappeared into the darkness, Jess felt a sharp pain in her side. She gasped, stumbling backwards. She'd been grazed by a bullet during the standoff, a wound she'd ignored in the heat of the moment. Now, the pain was unbearable. She sank to her knees, clutching her side. Blood seeped through her fingers, staining the red rock a darker shade. She was alone, wounded, and consumed by guilt. The fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd survived countless gunfights, faced down hardened criminals, and cheated death more times than she could count. And now, she was going to bleed out in some desolate canyon, a victim of her own choices. After a long while, Jess managed to drag herself back into the cave. The pain was excruciating, but she forced herself to stay conscious. She needed to tend to the wound, to stop the bleeding. She rummaged through her saddlebags, finding a strip of cloth and a flask of whiskey. She poured some of the whiskey onto the cloth, then pressed it against the wound. She bit back a scream, the alcohol burning like fire. She bandaged herself as best she could, her movements clumsy and weak. When she was finished, she leaned back against the cave wall, exhausted. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness wash over her. She didn't know how long she lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. But eventually, she heard a sound, a faint rustling, like someone moving nearby. She opened her eyes, her hand instinctively reaching for her rifle. But it wasn't the bounty hunter. It was Sarah. The young woman stood in the mouth of the cave, her face etched with concern. "She'd come back," Jess croaked, her voice barely audible. "Why did you come back?" Sarah stepped into the cave, her gaze fixed on Jess's wound. "He wasn't who he said he was," she said, her voice trembling. He was going to sell me to a saloon owner in Tucson." Jess closed her eyes, a wave of nausea washing over her. She'd traded Sarah from one danger to another, perhaps even worse. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't know." Sarah knelt beside her, gently examining the bandage. "It's all right," she said. "It's not your fault." She looked at Jess, her eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and gratitude. "He didn't get far. I managed to get away. He was drunk, celebrating his prize." Sarah didn't elaborate, but Jess could imagine the scene. The vulnerability, the desperation. Jess reached out, her hand trembling, and gently touched Sarah's arm. "You're safe now," she said, her voice hoarse. "I won't let anything happen to you." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. She took Jess's hand in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "I know," she said. "I trust you." The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge spanning the chasm of mistrust and betrayal. Jess didn't deserve Sarah's trust, not after what she'd done. But she would earn it. She would spend the rest of her life making amends for her mistake. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackling fire and the gentle murmur of the creek. The shared trauma had forged an unexpected bond between them, a silent understanding that transcended words. They were both survivors, scarred by the harsh realities of the West, but determined to find a way to heal, to move forward. Jess knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The bounty hunter wouldn't give up easily. He'd be back with more men. But she wasn't afraid. She had Sarah now, a reason to fight, a reason to live. She looked at the young woman beside her, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight. Sarah was more than just a runaway nun. She was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a chance for redemption. And Jess Harper, the hardened gunslinger, the woman who had sacrificed everything for her own survival, was finally ready to fight for something more. She would protect Sarah, no matter the cost. She would guide her through the treacherous landscape of the West, teaching her how to survive, how to thrive. She would become her protector, her mentor, her friend. And in doing so, she would finally find a way to forgive herself. The night deepened, the stars blazing in the vast expanse of the sky. Jess and Sarah huddled together in the cave, their bond growing stronger with each passing moment. They were two lost souls, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, but they had found each other, and that was enough. For now. The first light kissed the canyon rim, painting the red rock in hues of orange and gold. Jess stirred, pain lancing through her side. Sarah was already awake, tending the fire, her movements quiet and efficient. Jess watched her, a flicker of gratitude warming her heart. "Morning," Jess rasped, her voice still rough from sleep. Sarah turned, a small smile gracing her lips. "Morning. How's the wound?" "Hurts like a son of a—" Jess stopped herself, glancing at Sarah. "Hurts," she finished lamely. Sarah chuckled softly. "I made some tea. It'll help." Jess sat up slowly, wincing. She knew they couldn't stay here. The bounty hunter would be back, and this time, he wouldn't be alone. They needed to find a safer place, a place where they could defend themselves. "We gotta move," Jess said, her voice firm. "Head west, toward Salvation Pass. It's a narrow canyon, good for defense." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "I'll pack up." They moved quickly, efficiently. Jess, despite her injury, saddled their horses, her movements deliberate and focused. She checked her rifle, ensuring it was loaded and ready. She had a feeling they were going to need it. They rode in silence, the only sound the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves on the dusty trail. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, a tapestry of red rock, scrub brush, and endless sky. Jess scanned the horizon, her eyes sharp and watchful. She knew they were being followed. She could feel it in her gut. As they neared Salvation Pass, Jess reined in her horse. The canyon was even narrower than she remembered, its towering walls casting long shadows across the trail. It was the perfect place for an ambush. "We're not going through," Jess said, her voice low. "Well, sit up here. Use the rocks for cover." Sarah dismounted, her face pale but determined. She followed Jess's instructions, helping her to create a makeshift barricade of rocks and fallen branches. They worked in silence, their movements synchronized, their bond forged in the crucible of danger. The sun climbed higher in the sky, baking the canyon in its relentless heat. Jess felt a bead of sweat trickle down her forehead. She knew it wouldn't be long now. Then she heard it. The distant sound of horses' hooves, growing louder with each passing moment. The bounty hunter had found them. Jess took a deep breath, her hand tightening around the grip of her rifle. She looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and fear. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice firm. "No matter what happens." Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with apprehension. She knew what Jess was about to do. She was going to make a stand, to protect her, even if it meant sacrificing her own life. The bounty hunter and his men rounded the bend, their faces grim and determined. They saw Jess and Sarah, huddled behind their barricade, and a flicker of surprise crossed their faces. They hadn't expected them to stand and fight. "Harper!" the bounty hunter yelled, his voice echoing through the canyon. "It's over. Just give up, and I promise you, it'll be quick." Jess spat on the ground, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Go to hell," she said, her voice low and menacing. The bounty hunter sighed, shaking his head. All right, Harper. You asked for it. He raised his hand, signaling his men to attack. The canyon erupted in gunfire, the air thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. The bounty hunters' men charged, their rifles blazing. Jess returned fire, her shots precise and deadly. Men fell, screaming, their bodies tumbling into the dust. Sarah huddled behind the barricade, her hands clasped in prayer, her face pale with terror. Jess fought like a cornered wolf, her movements fluid and deadly. She dodged bullets, reloaded with lightning speed, and fired with unwavering accuracy. But she was outnumbered, outgunned. The bounty hunters' men were relentless, pressing their attack, slowly but surely gaining ground. A bullet whizzed past Jessie's ear, another grazed her arm. She felt a sharp pain in her side, the old wound throbbing. She was weakening, her strength failing. She knew she couldn't hold out much longer. Suddenly, she felt a searing pain in her shoulder. She cried out, stumbling backwards. She had been hit. The bounty hunter saw his chance, charging forward, his pistol raised. "It's over, Harper," he yelled, his voice filled with triumph. Jess braced herself for the final blow, closing her eyes, accepting her fate. But then she heard a different sound. A sharp crack, followed by a guttural scream. She opened her eyes and saw the bounty hunter crumble to the ground, a bullet hole in his chest. Standing behind him, rifle still smoking, was the silent rancher. He stood motionless, his face a mask of stoic indifference. He had appeared as if from nowhere, a phantom in the canyon. The remaining bounty hunters' men, stunned by the sudden turn of events, hesitated. Jess seized the opportunity, unleashing a volley of shots. More men fell, their courage broken. The rest scattered, fleeing to the desert, leaving their fallen comrades behind. The silence descended once more, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the soft whisper of the wind. Jess stood there panting, her body aching, her shoulder bleeding. She looked at the silent rancher, her eyes filled with gratitude. He nodded curtly, then turned and walked away, disappearing as silently as he had come. Sarah rushed to Jess's side, her face etched with concern. "Jess, you're hurt." She helped Jess back to the barricade, gently examining her wounds. The bullet in her shoulder had passed clean through, but it was bleeding profusely. "It'll be all right," Jess rasped, her voice weak. "Just need to patch it up." Sarah tore a strip of cloth from her dress, using it to bind Jess's shoulder. Her touch was gentle, her movements efficient. Jess watched her, her heart filled with a strange sense of peace. Sarah, the runaway nun, was tending to her wounds, her faith rekindled by this silent act of courage. "Thank you," Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah looked at her, her eyes filled with compassion. "It's all right, Jess. We'll get through this. Together." The first rays of sunset painted the canyon walls in hues of red and gold. Jess leaned back against the rocks, exhausted, but alive. Sarah sat beside her, humming a soft melody, her presence a soothing balm to Jess's battered soul. The healing had begun, not just of the body, but of the spirit. A silent bond had been forged, a connection born of shared trauma and unwavering faith. The West was still a dangerous place, but for the first time in a long time, Jess felt a glimmer of hope. The crimson stain of sunset deepened, swallowing the gold that had painted Salvation Pass. Jess leaned against the rough canyon wall, Sarah beside her, their shared silence a comfort now. The dead were left to the buzzards. The living, they had choices to make. Jess knew, looking at Sarah's quiet face, that their paths, though intertwined for a time, were diverging again. The convent shed run from still cold to her, a beacon in the wilderness of her soul. And Jess belonged to the dust and the gun. Salvation pass ain't a home. Sarah. Jess finally rasped, the words scraping against her throat. Her shoulder throbbed, a dull counterpoint to the sharper ache in her heart. Sarah looked up, her eyes reflecting the dying light. I know, but I don't know where to go. Jess reached out, her calloused hand gently cupping Sarah's cheek. There's a stage runs east from Redemption, goes all the way to St. Louis. Maybe you could find a convent there. A new start. Sarah's eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. She was stronger now, tempered by fire. And you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jess looked out at the vast, unforgiving landscape. This is my home. Always has been. She didn't elaborate. There was no need. Sarah understood. They shared a small piece of dried meat, their last meal together. The moon climbed high, casting long, skeletal shadows across the canyon floor. Jess helped Sarah onto the back of the least skittish horse, handing her a canteen filled with water. Head east at first light, Jess instructed, her voice gruff but tender. Stick to the high ground. Less chance of trouble. Sarah nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. She reached down and took Jess's hand, her grip firm. Thank you, Jess, for everything. Jess squeezed her hand, unable to speak. The words caught in her throat, a lump of unshed tears and unspoken gratitude. Then, Sarah turned her horse and rode away, disappearing into the darkness. A solitary figure silhouetted against the starry sky. Jess watched her go, her heart aching with a bittersweet sorrow. The West was a lonely place. But sometimes, even in the loneliest of places, you could find a moment of connection, a fleeting glimpse of hope. And sometimes, that was enough to keep you going. Jess knew she'd never forget Sarah, the runaway nun who had taught her that even a hardened gunslinger could still find redemption. She watched until the sound of the horse's hooves faded into the night. Then she turned and walked back to her lonely camp, the silent canyon her only companion. The West stretched out before her, vast and unforgiving. But Jess Harper was ready. She was a survivor. And she would keep surviving, one day at a time, until the end of the line.